So, the prologue, When Colston Falls. On a sunny Sunday afternoon last month, Black Lives Matter protesters in Bristol, England, pulled down a statue of Edward Colston from its pedestal, dragged it through the city's streets and dumped it into the harbour. Colston, who some revered for his philanthropic donations to schools and hospitals, was a 17th century slave trader. He had made his fortune through his involvement in the Royal African Company, a mercantile corporation that oversaw the forced removal, transportation, and annihilation of hundreds of thousands of black Africans. The dismantling of his statue, which had stood for 125 years, was an iconic event in the demonstrations across the United Kingdom, adding new momentum to campaigns to remove or replace public monuments and to rename buildings that have racist colonial connections. Only a few days ago, the empty base was filled, albeit temporarily, with a sculpture of Black Lives Matter protester Jen Reid. This itself divided opinions. Some welcomed its presence, but others suggested that the white artist Mark Quinn had further colonised space and narrative. Hours after Colston's statue fell in June, Liam Rosenior, a professional soccer coach for Derby County, tweeted his reaction. He informed his followers that Rosenior is a slave name, and that when he was a child growing up in Bristol, he had attended a school named after Colston. His tweet ended, "Pardon me for enjoying this moment of irony." Just a couple of days earlier, Rosenior, a keen scholar of black history and whose daughters are American citizens, had written an open letter to Donald Trump in the Guardian newspaper, condemning the US president's, quote, open hatred, indifference, and disregard towards a people subjugated by physical, economic, mental, and emotional abuse for more than 400 years, unquote. Rosenior's words echoed those of another black British former soccer player, Howard Gale. In 2016, Gale publicly rejected the award of an MBE, the Member of the Order of the British Empire, which is part of an array of honours conferred annually by Queen Elizabeth II because of its associations with British colonialism. Both players trace parts of their family histories to Sierra Leone. Already a major location in the transatlantic slave trade, Britain's principal role in the industry and decimation of the population there commenced in the early 1600s. Later on, at the end of the 18th century, Sierra Leone was selected by British abolitionists and philanthropists as the site for the repatriation of London's so-called Black Poor, including freed slaves and African Americans who had fought for the British Army in the US Revolution. When you look at what the empire did to my family and our ancestors, it just doesn't bear credence, Gale stated. I would always have felt uncomfortable writing those letters, MBE, after my name. I begin this paper with this scene setting to introduce my argument that a transnational analytical frame enhances our understanding of racism in soccer, both in relation to the processes of racial formation through which black bodies are othered, and in terms of the black diasporic critique that can underpin a progressive politics of racialized resistance. Before I talk any further about anti-racist responses in soccer, I want to say something briefly about the articulation of racism, specifically how racism coalesces with constructions of nation and the idea of bordering, following Nero Yuval Davis, as a social practice. While racism in sport tends to be analysed through a lens of methodological nationalism, that is, within the confines of individual nation states, localized manifestations of anti-blackness in fact draw on notions of racism that are globally situated and geographically fluid, as well as being drawn from colonial ideologies and discourses. As examples, I use the experiences of two black star soccer players, Eniola Aluko and Raheem Sterling. Both were born overseas, in Lagos, Nigeria, and Kingston, Jamaica, respectively, and their treatment is indicative of the way that borders are attached to individual bodies in processes of othering, inflecting intersectional racial contingencies onto notions of sporting Britishness. As Oliver Belcher and colleagues note, quote, borders do more than simply mark territorial margins. Borders are epistemological and material sites with the power to shape subjectivities, differentiate and produce categories of citizen and migrant, and trace inclusive and exclusive fields of possibilities as well as limits, unquote. During her time with the England national setup, which was characterised by a litany of racial microaggressions and gendered white supremacy, coaching staff not only demonised and discriminated against her blackness, but also rendered Aluko a foreign body. One white male coach talked to her routinely in a mock Caribbean accent, and she was described as lazy in a recorded performance analysis. On another occasion, during a discussion over her relatives visiting from Nigeria, manager Mark Sampson responded, "Make sure they don't come over with Ebola." These comments combine a careless yet conscious homogenisation of blackness, a malicious and ignorant pathologisation of Africa, and a racialisation of English sporting citizenship that differentiates and dictates who is deemed to really belong. Sterling is constantly vilified in tabloid newspapers for his cultural tastes, personal expenditure, and lifestyle. He symbolises another iteration of the cultural policing of what sports stars of colour look like, wear, and do to their bodies, representing the dominant criminalisation, both actual and figurative, of doing almost anything while black. His treatment needs to be located in the context of the UK's recent Windrush scandal. In short, under the government's hostile environment policy, it was revealed in 2018 that Caribbean communities in Britain were required to provide copious formal evidence of their right to be in the UK, despite the fact that those that migrated there in the post-war era were never required to possess such documentation because they came as British citizens. This led to an undefined number of black Britons forced into unemployment, refused access to benefits, healthcare and pensions, and even deported. The ad hominem and egregiously unfounded attacks by the media on Sterling's character and lifestyle and consumption practices represent the demonisation and criminalisation of blackness, but also Jamaican identity in particular in the UK. Both Aluko and Sterling illustrate how a geographically expansive lens is key to understanding the expression of racism in soccer. I now turn to a consideration of how a more transnational and transhistorical understanding is key to its challenge as well. Ten days after the toppling of Colston's statue, Premier League soccer returned after its COVID-19 enforced intermission. During this break in play, the extent and outcomes of a different pandemic were brought to global public attention: systemic anti-black racism. Following the killing of African Americans, including David McAtee, George Floyd, Tony McDade, and Breonna Taylor, by police officers or members of the US National Guard, anti-racist protests took place in a variety of cultural settings across the world. For the first round of resumed English soccer matches, Black Lives Matter replaced players' names on the backs of their jerseys. Players and officials have since taken a knee immediately before kickoff in every remaining game to show their solidarity and collective opposition to racism. Sport participation and stardom do not provide reprieve from larger societal racist violence, writes the anthropologist Stanley Thangaraj. In an unprecedented contribution to the public conversation on race in the UK, several black elite soccer players, men and women, spoke out powerfully against global racial injustice. Watford's Andre Gray, whose back is tattooed with a montage of historic US, South African and Jamaican political and cultural leaders, stated, quote, "So the marches over here are not just for the police brutality in America. It's for England as well, and Paris, and all over the world. It's because of the systemic racism that is everywhere," unquote. Both Nedum Anua, a British player for Real Salt Lake in the MLS, and the US international DeAndre Yedlin, who plays for Newcastle United, described how they felt fearful as young black men in the United States, especially during interactions with police officers. Aston Villa's Anita Asante and Liverpool's Rinsola Babajide drew attention to common straight practices of anti-blackness and police brutality in the US and the UK. Jess Carter of Chelsea and Ebony Salmon of Bristol City, meanwhile, emphasised the significance of the global anti-racist protests, plus their own capacity to be role models for young black women. The involvement and leadership of black soccer players, as well as support from a number of white allies, was a well-noted feature of the popular anti-racist uprisings of summer 2020 in the UK. Yet academic and journalistic commentaries on these developments tend to restrict the influence and impact of key sports people to particular spaces and times. They do not acknowledge that the orientations and perspectives underpinning the players' activism are in fact both transnational and transhistorical in scope. This viewpoint disconnects the players' actions from other people, places, and periods. It deters any consideration of how the principles, purpose, and power of what they say and do are informed and nourished by transnational networks and interactions, and inhibits recognition of how they often draw on happenings and movements from the sometimes distant past as well as the present. As the examples in this paper illustrate, black soccer players are familiar with manifestations of anti-blackness and white supremacy in other places and from varied points in history. Connecting them to the issues and problems of modern English soccer and British society allows these athletes to contextualise and comprehend their own experiences and struggles. Moreover, drawing on the techniques and tactics of global anti-racism enables them to align in critical mass against racism and other social injustices on both local and worldwide scales. They protest against global inequality and oppression, as well as the difficulties they face in their own careers. They speak outside their sport, beyond their nation, and past their own lifetimes. Yet at the same time, they refuse to displace racism as external to the UK. Instead, they draw attention to its presence, not least in sport and in the police, forming part of what the sociologist Gargi Bhattacharya labels a globally integrated machinery of state racism. The scholar activist Arooj Shahzadi states that if we do not organise our collective strength, we risk losing deeply important histories and collective solutions. Black Lives Matter has shown that an expansive cross-cultural and transnational politics and practice of anti-racism is fundamental to challenging anti-blackness and white racial violence as a global phenomenon. Black soccer players and sports people more widely have outlined and enacted a compelling approach to striving for racial justice in sport and society. As professional soccer institutions face up to their own need for deep self-reflection, structural reform, and more radical anti-racist policies, they could do far worse than follow the players' lead. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have a question, and this particular attendee would like to ask this question. So I am going to unmute our attendee. And our attendee, if you wouldn't mind also saying your name aloud, so then we know who you are. I'm going to allow you to talk right now.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Dumbi Otinya. My question is more about you talked a lot about Nigerian players and African soccer players. What are your thoughts for African players that play in the World Cup for countries that are not indigenous to them, and when they go get nationalized to play for other countries? Do you think it's a drain of talent from African soccer players?
Okay, thanks very much for the question. So I guess you're referring to I guess countries like France or England, where the players are drawn from kind of the African diaspora. I think it's a really interesting really interesting question to consider. I know that in the case of the French national team, the French men's national team, in the 2018 World Cup, there was kind of a divided sort of view on this, particularly amongst kind of scholars and activists, with some saying, this is fantastic, it's really positive, it's a clear kind of validation of the multicultural futures of these countries, whereas others were saying, no, this is, as you were saying, a kind of drain on talent. It's a further stage of colonialism, whereby particular bodies are being used to serve the benefits of the particularly the European nation. I think this is where fundamentally where sport is interesting, and we know sport's interesting in a number of ways around race and diaspora. But in some ways, the kind of citizenship rules, if we can call them that, around international soccer are more fluid and sort of more in line with kind of diasporic identity than the actual citizenship laws of a number of countries. So I think I guess I'd probably sit somewhere in the middle. I think it's problematic in some ways, but I do think sport does open up some opportunities and possibilities for thinking about diaspora and citizenship and sort of multicultural citizenship in ways which kind of governments and the state could learn a lot from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And we have a question from Javier Wallace, and I am going to unmute you, Javier, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Good morning from Texas. Just wondering, could you speak more about the legacy of the Windrush and the large arrival of Black West Indians within the current activism of Black footballers in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Javier. Nice to hear from you. Hope you're well. Interestingly, I probably should say a little bit more about. I'm cognizant I skimmed over the Windrush history a little bit. It's the Windrush Generation is a term which is given to post Second World War migrants from the Caribbean to the UK, because some of the early migrants arrived on a ship that was named the Windrush. I'm not aware of. I'm just thinking. I'm not aware of any current players who've explicitly invoked the Windrush in their activism. I mean, in some ways, the issue around the Windrush scandal, the deportations and the denying of benefits, that happened. You know, it's still going on, but it came to a head a couple of years ago, which in some ways was just at the point before the kind of black activism in English soccer really took off. I mean, it's always been going on in some ways, but just before it sort of became really to public attention. So I'm not aware of players who have spoken specifically about that, but it's absolutely in the consciousness and the kind of orientations of these players. You know, Raheem Sterling, for example, will speak very much about, you know, his Jamaican background and the fact that, you know, members of his family are part of that generation. So I think it's not necessarily always explicit or overt, but it's absolutely part of the sort of orientation of those individuals. I'm probably run out of time, so I'm sorry if I'm cutting off my own answer a little bit on that.
Wonderful. All right, so that is our time with our first presenter. Thank you so much to Dr. Burdsey for setting us up for success.